Hello, everyone. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to speak about philosophy with our new guest, Kane Baker. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yep. So we are going to talk about metaphysics in general and maybe metaphysics in thought of philosophers of 20th century, and maybe about analytical philosophy. I don't know what direction we will choose. Also, I hope we would discuss some crucial moments in the history of ideas and philosophical use, as I understand, of, for example, Heidegger or analytical school at all. So I can give the floor to you, Kane, if you want to introduce yourself to our audience, and we could start. And one more thing, please subscribe to our guest channel. The link is in the description. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never been that good at introductions, so I'm Kane. I have a YouTube channel. Had it for quite a few years. I upload stuff on philosophy. I also have done a philosophy degree, masters, and I'm coming to the end of a PhD. And that's me. So yeah.
Nice. Okay. So you would be a philosopher in the future. So you will, I don't know, write some work about philosophy or a history of philosophy, history of thoughts, and so on and so on.
Well, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I look, I've spent a lot of time doing philosophy. I'd like to continue doing philosophy as much as I can, but who knows what will occur in the future. Yeah.
That's like me in history of antiquity. Okay. So I've watched several videos on your channel, and as far as I know, you are skeptical enough about metaphysics, as far as I know. As I get, you think I mean, philosophers, like people that could think about philosophy, we don't have access to this sort of knowledge, and this metaphysical knowledge is overestimated, as far as I get of your videos. So let's begin with these terms. What do you think about philosophy itself? What is philosophy to you, and what is metaphysics to you in itself?
Okay.
And why do European folk, I mean, sorry, one more moment, why do European folk attribute this direction of thought, I mean, the sort of Aristotle about metaphysics, for example, to philosophy of 20th century? Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, so what is philosophy? Is well, that's a difficult question to answer, and I'm not sure that this is something that can be summed up in a single definition, because there are so many different traditions of philosophy, and actually the way that we think about philosophy and what philosophy is has changed significantly over time. I mean, if you go back 600, 700 years, then people back then didn't make exactly the same distinction between, say, philosophy and science that we would do today. So the way that I tend to think about philosophy is that there's a nice quote by a philosopher called Wilfrid Sellars, and he says that philosophy is the study of how things, in the broadest sense of the term, hang together in the broadest sense of the term. And that's perhaps not exactly enlightening, but if I was to sum up the way I think about philosophy, that probably gets it, right? Like, very often what I think we're doing is kind of like, we have all of these practices in our lives, so there are all sorts of practices that we engage in. We engage in art, we engage in scientific study, we perform experiments, we do mathematics, we make moral claims, all of these different practices. In philosophy, we kind of step back from these, and we ask questions like, okay, what are we doing when we engage in such practices, and what is the justification for engaging in such practices? So, in the context of something like science, philosophers will ask questions like, what is the scientific method? What is the distinction between science and non-science? Why should we trust science? Questions like that. So we're sort of stepping back from the the practices of that we engage in everyday life, and subjecting them to critical analysis. Now, obviously, you can't capture all of philosophy in that framework, and so, as I say, it's not exactly a definition, but I think that pretty much sums up what I take myself to be doing, insofar as I'm doing philosophy. So I'm not sure if that's an adequate answer, but that's the answer I'm giving.
Oh, that's a great answer. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Okay.
And then you asked... Sorry, go ahead.
About metaphysics. And do you think that philosophy changed as a direction? I mean, as a human occupation seen the time of Socrates? I mean, the root sense, in the sense of root, in the sense of occupation of humankind. I mean, the moral questions and the questions of, I don't know, about ontology, about axiology, about metaphysics, and so
on. So just to take those one at a time. So what is metaphysics? So as I see it, metaphysics is inquiry into the fundamental structure and nature of reality, right? Like, we want to know how the world, the universe, right, is on a kind of fundamental level. So metaphysics will ask questions about, like, what is the nature of time? What is the nature of causality? Are there laws of nature? That kind of thing. It's looking at the fundamental nature of the world. So then you asked, like, how has philosophy changed? Was that
since Socrates? Yeah.
I don't know. Well, I guess that would be perhaps more a question for the historian of ideas. I think that. So, yes, I mean the very the very definition of what we count as philosophy, I think, has changed insofar as today we draw quite strict distinctions between philosophical inquiry and empirical inquiry. For instance, like the sciences are often seen as being separate from philosophy, in a way that I don't think, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this because I'm not a historian, but I don't think that such a strict distinction was made, like back in ancient Greece. I do think that to some extent, some of the more recent changes I see as somewhat negative. I mean, obviously, philosophy, like all disciplines, has become highly professionalized, highly specialized, and today philosophy is. I think that today when we judge philosophy, right, we judge it on the basis of essentially the production of new research, right? So we're trying to kind of expand the bleeding edge, expand the frontiers, and the philosopher, the professional philosopher who produces the most new philosophical articles will thereby be judged a better philosopher by institutional standards, right? Like, you're more likely to get a job, essentially, right, if you're publishing articles that expand the bleeding edge. So it seems like with the...
sorry for interrupting you. You say that now we have two directions, institutions and philosophy itself. So we have a philosopher that need to be in the institution of philosophy. I mean, in the university or some, I don't know, some place where he can study or research some way of philosophy study. I mean, in direction of the all of the, for example, analytical philosophical school. Yeah, for example.
Well, it's not so much that like somebody doing philosophy would need to be in that institution, but it's just that's what philosophy as a professional discipline is, right? Like, I mean, you could have somebody doing philosophy outside of an academic context, outside of academic institutions, but like, I mean, if you're looking to have a job as a philosopher, if you want to make a living as a philosopher, then you're basically going to have to go into academic institutions and follow the kind of standards that they set down for what counts as good philosophy, right? Like, so unless you're just independent, if you just have like loads of money and you're independently wealthy, then it doesn't matter, you do what you want. But if you actually want to make a living doing this, then that's what you have to do. And I do wonder if in some ways the sort of standards by which we judge philosophy from an institutional point of view have led to it being kind of becoming divorced from the things that like concern most people. So I think, like, if you go back thousands of years, maybe back to ancient Greece, philosophers did try to engage with the public, right? Like, they tried to answer questions about, like, what counts as a good life, and what is justice and all of this in a way that would actually have had practical consequences for the people alive at the time, most of the people alive at the time. And the way that we do philosophy now, it's become institutionalized, and in particular, there is no value whatsoever in doing any kind of public engagement work, at least in terms of, again, getting a job, getting paid, right? The only standard by which we judge professional philosophers is publishing new articles, well, making, giving reports at conferences and stuff, articles and reports that may be read by, like, 10 people. So that's one way in which modern philosophy that's one direction that modern philosophy has gone that might not be so positive. I'm not sure. I mean, there are many ways in which the professionalization and specialization is a good thing, but I do worry that philosophy has become increasingly divorced from the concerns that anybody else would have. It's like, as a discipline, has kind of removed itself from like the rest of society, and I'm not sure that's a good thing.
Okay, so in this case, what do you think about? Sorry, my mic was broken. sorry, about 5 minutes or so. So I've said that I thought about your recent videos about metaphysics, and I've watched several videos on your channel. And as far as I know, you think that metaphysical knowledge is overestimated, and that certain knowledge that we could, in terms of analytical philosophy, for example, determines as metaphysical, is not so positive in a way of positivism, for example. So, what do you think is metaphysics itself, and metaphysics in the works of, for example, of Heidegger or any philosophers of 20th century or 21st century?
Well, I mean, I can't comment on Heidegger because I really don't know his work.
Yes, you said, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I am very skeptical of the value of metaphysical inquiry. Look, as I said, metaphysics involves inquiry into the fundamental nature and structure of reality, right? And the kind of line that I want to take on this is that sort of information just isn't accessible to us. There is just no way of forming justified beliefs about the kind of things that metaphysics wants to form justified beliefs about. So I tend to take a pretty hardcore empiricist line on this sort of stuff. And when I say that I'm an empiricist, maybe I should just clarify that, because empiricism is a term that, like many philosophical terms, has lots of different definitions.
For example, in antiquity. Yeah.
Yes. You can kind of find an empiricist tradition extending back a long way. In sort of philosophy 101, as it were, empiricism is often defined as the claim that all our ideas are derived from sense experience. So this is the kind of empiricism that was endorsed by people like David Hume and John Locke.
And there were some more kind of directions. For example, essentialism and hedonism in the thought of Hume, for example. As far as I know, I can't certainly say if it's true.
Yeah, I mean,
what's the difference? I mean, essentialism, empiricism.
Between essentialism and empiricism, did you say?
Yeah, certainly.
I don't know if they're necessary. Well, there wouldn't necessarily be a difference between those. So essentialism is, I guess, how would it be defined? I mean, it depends on the context, but it's so. Okay, if we're talking about, for instance, the things in the world, right, then we might think that they form like natural kinds. And in that context, the idea of essentialism would be that what distinguishes a natural kind is that there is some property that is necessary and sufficient for something to be a member of that kind. So if you think about, say, the chemical elements, take hydrogen, right? The essential property of hydrogen is that it is an atom with 1 proton. The essential property of mercury is that it's an atom with 80 protons, because, right, anything that is composed of atoms with 80 protons is mercury, and anything that isn't is not mercury. And what's more, we can kind of use this property that is shared by all hydrogen or all mercury. We can use this property to then explain the other features of these things. So in the case of mercury, right, we can explain its relation with other elements and the kind of reactions that it enters into by appealing to the fact that it is an atom with 80 protons, or that it's a substance consisting of atoms with 80 protons. So essentialism is going to say that like all natural kinds are grouped according to properties that are necessary and sufficient for kind membership. Now, I mean, in principle, an empiricist might be an essentialist, although generally speaking, empiricists tend to be pretty skeptical of essentialism, and this is just because empiricists are just in general pretty resistant to metaphysical theorizing. So, you know, the idea that like there are natural kinds in the world and that we can group them and that they have essential properties and all of this, that tends to be something that empiricists will resist. So just to, I guess, clarify what I take empiricism to be.
Okay. And sorry, one more moment. How skepticism differs from empiricism?
Yeah, so skepticism is like an attitude that one can have in various different contexts. Empiricists are skeptics in certain contexts, but not in others, right? I suppose
a certain sphere.
If you were to like talk about skepticism just as a philosophical position in itself, then I would understand that to perhaps be the view that no beliefs have any justification, that, you know, we should suspend judgment just across the board or something like that, right? So empiricists, you know, like you have on the one hand, say, a skeptic, like a hardcore skeptic who says that we just have no justification for any of our beliefs, like we should suspend judgment about everything. We can never know anything. We have no access to any knowledge whatsoever, on the one extreme. And then on another extreme, you know, you might have somebody who thinks actually we can have knowledge of all sorts of things. Like we have knowledge of mathematical facts and scientific facts and metaphysical facts. You know, like this person just thinks that like the world is kind of fully accessible to our knowledge. Empiricists are going to be somewhere in the middle, right? They're going to be very skeptical of claims which go beyond what can be revealed in experience. So for an empiricist, ultimately, the justification for our beliefs rests in observable experience. So like it's fine to say that, you know, I have 2 hands. I can have knowledge of that. Maybe not certainty, right? I can't be certain that I have 2 hands, but I can have some confidence that I have 2 hands because, you know, I have certain sensory data, and that seems to reveal that I have 2 hands. empiricists are pretty happy with that, but claims that go, beyond what can be revealed in experience, claims about, morality, modality, mathematics, empiricists are going to be, again, more skeptical of this sort of stuff.
Okay, what is metaphysics of, for example, well-known philosophers, for example, Ludwig Wittgenstein or Jürgen Habermas or I don't know, postmodernist philosophers of 21st century. For example, the philosophers who claim that we go away of physics, and now, because of we stand in this position that we are on the superposition of ontology, of experience of ontology, we claim ourselves metaphysical philosophers. What kind of philosophers in this time or in 20th century would get these metaphysical questions in their such in their back? I don't know.
I'm not
As
sure
a
that
notebook.
I'm familiar with what you're referring to.
Ludwig Wittgenstein, about his linguistic game, I mean metaphysics of presence, Dasein of Heidegger, and philosophy of metaphysical review of Jürgen Habermas and Karl Appel.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I don't know much about like Heidegger or Habermas. That's kind of outside of my field of expertise. So I'm not sure I'm actually familiar with just the like I say, the topic here.
Okay, can we find in all philosophy that you can speak about metaphysics that we can deconstruct? I mean, since for example, Immanuel Kant.
Well, my background is in analytic philosophy, so I mean, I suppose, if you wanted to talk about this stuff,
okay,
maybe you could, I perhaps just briefly outline what the ideas are. I don't know if I would have much of interest to say, though.
It's not a problem. We can change our discourse. It's not a problem.
I mean, yeah, so yeah, like I said, I mean, my background is very much in analytic philosophy, and once you go outside of analytic philosophy, I really don't know enough to say anything intelligent. I did once teach Sartre, but I've basically entirely forgotten it, and that's pretty much as far as it goes, as when it comes to the continental stuff. So
French school, okay.
I mean, you did mention Wittgenstein, and yeah, I mean, obviously Wittgenstein had significant influence on analytic philosophy in a way that was it also kind of resistant to metaphysics, or at least the way that people had traditionally approached metaphysics. So very often what people were doing in metaphysics, and I say were doing, what people continue to do to this day in metaphysics, is they will try to account for the success of various discourses by postulating the existence of entities beyond what is revealed in experience, in order to explain the success of certain discourses. So, for instance, when people engage in moral arguments, right, it seems, many people have the intuition at least, that we are kind of uncovering moral facts. So many people want to say that we are discovering moral facts. And, this has led a lot of philosophers to think, okay, well, maybe there really are moral facts, right? Maybe moral claims are true, and are true or false, and what makes them true or false is whether or not they correspond to the moral facts. So we're postulating this realm of moral facts that kind of accounts for our practice of moral discourse. Similarly in, say, mathematics, right? Philosophers have postulated a realm of mathematical entities, a kind of Platonic third realm of abstract entities that mathematical claims are true of. So it's this
mathematical
kind of, it's explanation by postulation. And actually, you know, Wittgenstein, certainly like later Wittgenstein especially, it raised a significant challenge to that. Although I think that, you know, with Wittgenstein's idea of like language games and so on, it's not a challenge that I find that persuasive. I think that Wittgenstein the fundamental problem that Wittgenstein made is that his views rest on an idea of meaning as use, right? So like the meaning of a statement is just how that statement is used, and that's, I think, that's correct, like in principle, but we need to draw a distinction between semantics and pragmatics, and so the semantics would be like what the meaning of a statement is, and then the pragmatics is what you do with that statement. So if I say, for instance, there's the door, and I point, I'm really angry, like we're having a debate and I get really angry and I shout and point, I say there's the door. Well, the semantics of that is that it's just a proposition which describes the location of something in the world, but pragmatically I'm using it to express anger or express a command. I'm saying like get out, right? And I think that it seems to me that's a crucial distinction which was overlooked in a lot of Wittgenstein's work, and so, you know, I wouldn't say that I'm a Wittgensteinian. I think that my reasons for resisting metaphysics are quite different to his.
Okay. So about moral questions, we have an interesting one on chat. Can moral nihilists have ethical preferences? And another question. What does Kane think about utilitarian hedonism of John Stuart Mill, especially his argument for intellectual pleasure? Sorry. Two questions.
Yeah, okay. So moral nihilism and ethical preferences. Well, of course. So it depends on the moral nihilist in question, right? So as I understand it, moral nihilism would just be the view that all moral claims are false, or at least like there are no moral values. Or at least there are no objective moral values, let's say. So the world in itself is, you know, absent of any value or any obligation, and morality is perhaps just a fiction, or maybe not even that. Maybe when we make moral statements, we're just like expressing emotions or expressing commands or something like that. You know, we're not even attempting to describe the world. That phrase moral nihilism is not one that's often used in professional philosophy, but I'm assuming that this is the kind of view they have in mind, right? Like there are no objective moral values. Now, clearly, I think a nihilist can have preferences. I mean, it would be very unusual for there to be a human being who doesn't have preferences. That might not even be coherent, right? Like it might not be something we can really even imagine, unless you're just imagining somebody in a coma. But if you're imagining somebody who is engaged in action, it seems like they must have some sort of preferences, because otherwise, you know, what basis would they have for performing one action rather than another? Like if I decide to go downstairs and get some food, presumably that's because I'm hungry and I desire not to be hungry anymore. So, you know, certainly they have preferences. Now the question would be, could they have ethical preferences? And that depends on, I mean, it depends on how they're characterizing like the specific details of their nihilism. So on one extreme, you have people like Max Stirner, say, who just rejects morality, right? They say that this whole system of taking ourselves...
Sorry, in German, Max Stirner.
Oh, yeah. Is it? Did I pronounce it incorrectly?
S-T-I... Okay. Yes, sorry.
I may not have got the correct pronunciation. What was it again?
Max Stirner.
Stirner. Oh, I don't know if I'm going to be... Stirner. Okay. Good to know. So somebody like him, you know, he just says like, no, like I reject this whole kind
universe.
of practice, the whole thing, right? I'm not going. I don't take myself to be under any kind of moral obligation or any other type of obligation for that matter. But that's pretty rare, right? Like most people who characterize themselves as moral nihilists or moral anti-realists will say, okay, look. There's something very useful about this, right? Like there are good reasons to engage in moral discourse. It serves useful functions, and one of the reasons why this serves useful functions is that it turns out, thankfully, that most of us have quite similar values. Like there are certain things that all of us tend to want. You know, we all want to, maybe not all of us, but most of us at least, want to live in a society that is peaceful and prosperous. We want to live in a society where everybody respects each other, where maybe we have systems of property rights and so on, so that, you know, you can't just come into my house and take all my stuff. It would be pretty unpleasant to live in a world where, you know, everybody was just constantly stealing from each other and killing each other. So, you know, we want to have certain mechanisms in society to encourage these sort of outcomes, to encourage people to be... Oh, hello? Oh dear.
Yeah. Is everything okay?
Everything's fine here. It seemed we lost the connection.
Maybe it's my connection. Sorry for that.
I don't know. It could have been over here. Is everything all right now? Shall I?
Everything all right? Yeah.
Okay. So just to continue from where I left off. Yeah. So there are certain things. You know, there are things that we all tend to want. You know, and we want certain mechanisms in society to encourage this. And one of these is our practice of making moral judgments. You know, you like part of inculcating children into the sort of values we want them to have is this practice of saying things like, you know, that's good, that's bad, that's right, that's wrong, you ought not to do this. So so a lot of nihilists will say is, you know, okay, maybe there are no moral facts, but there is still a useful purpose served by this discourse. So it's, you know, it's useful for us to act as if there are moral facts. And it's not actually that unusual for there to be situations where it's useful to act as if certain falsehoods were true. Like even in science, for instance, when we send probes to Pluto, I believe that making those calculations, the scientists and engineers will use Newtonian mechanics. Newtonian mechanics has been displaced by general relativity, but Newtonian mechanics is simpler and it works well enough. So we just act as if Newtonian mechanics were true, right? We carry on using it in the contexts where it's applicable, and we just, you know, proceed as if
it's useful. It's just useful. Yeah.
And so,
okay,
you know, like, why not take the same sort of view of morality? Yeah, so that's whether a moral nihilist will have ethical preferences is going to depend on the sort of line they take there. I mean, as I say, most professional philosophers who tend towards nihilist positions will still take our practice of making moral judgments to be justified. It's just justified in other ways. You know, it's justified for its utility rather than as something that describes reality. And for what it's worth, I mean, my own, like, look, I make moral judgments. I'm very firmly on the anti-realist side, but I'm perfectly happy to help myself to moral discourse. I continue going around saying that's right, that's wrong, and I continue exploring moral theories and so on. Yeah, I, despite being a moral nihilist, I would still say that I have ethical preferences.
As we all have such preferences, I think.
Well, maybe. I mean, there are some people who say they don't, and I think, you know, look, I'm actually quite attracted. I mean, at the end of the day, right, I can't fully endorse the kind of Stirnerite position because because I just like engaging in moral discourse. I just enjoy it, right? I like doing it, so I'm going to carry on doing it. But I mean, I think that there are some I think there are good reasons to take, let's say, moral abolitionism seriously, right? Like the idea that actually we should just do away with this practice of making moral judgments entirely. It's I think, a very plausible position.
So in our chat, we have some medieval philosophers or theologists that's asking about existence of God and celestial spirits. No, I think I can ask one of this question. What does Kane think about cosmological and ontological arguments for existence of God?
Okay, I mean that's a big question, because there are so many different kinds of each of those arguments. All right, well, look, I've already said that I am very skeptical of metaphysics. I tend to resist metaphysics, and I mean, when it comes to metaphysics, like stuff like the ontological argument and cosmological arguments, you don't get more metaphysical than that. The ontological argument, I mean, this isn't really a philosophical point, but I quite like it. I like it because I think it's so brazen. It's kind of ballsy. I say it's there's just something about it where it's like, okay, this is obvious nonsense, but I have to admire the nerve of somebody who came up with this thing. So I don't know. It's hard to comment on them because there are so many different types of those arguments. I don't know if there's a more specific question there, but with respect to with respect to like the ontological argument, the simple response to that is going to be, you can't define things into existence. And if you want a more substantive response, like the idea that there is actually an objective fact of the matter, that something is greater than something else, if we're taking, say, Anselm's ontological argument, obviously I reject that. With respect to cosmological arguments, well, where I'm going to resist them is the idea that there's, say, an objective fact of the matter about causality, explanation, contingency, and necessity. I mean, again, it depends on what cosmological argument you have in mind, but, I'm going to take an anti-realist line on basically all of these things. So, for instance, the idea that, like, there are contingent beings and that, we're therefore going to end up having to postulate a necessary being to explain that. I do not think that contingency and necessity are properties of the world. I see them as being properties of certain models, but I don't think that there are any modal properties like in the world itself, or at least I don't think there's any good reason to believe that there are. The world just is the way it is. Nothing is necessary or contingent. So, and similarly with like causality, I'm an anti-realist about causality. From that kind of empiricist background, obviously I'm going to have a lot of problems with these arguments. But if you want a more, I guess, precise answer, then you need to specify which argument exactly you have in mind. I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think that's the most correct and marvelous answer. Thank you, because I've recently reread Thomas Aquinas, and I think that the most strange thing of Thomas is that he uses Aristotle for his theological work, but it's. For metaphysics of Aristotle, it's not strange because he himself, Aristotle, stated that philosophy of main reasons, for example, or main questions of philosophy, the first philosophy, is the questions that is above all the questions of other types. For example, positive knowledge, or I don't know, the way of things go on and so on. And let's come back to the question of morality, about moral questions, if you like it. What do you think about Trolley Problem, about this thought experiment of ethics?
I mean, are they asking me what I would do in that situation, or just
no? I mean, the precise definition of this experiment, is it good experiment or a problem? Is it good problem? Is it good dilemma? Or not?
I mean, I guess it depends on what exactly you're using it to do, like what role it's taking in the argument. I mean, there are definitely contexts where you could use the trolley problem as part of a good argument. So I guess just in general, when it comes to these kinds of thought experiments, like the way that a lot of people approach them is, okay, we have some sort of moral principle, right? And let's take a very simple example. Like, let's say the moral principle is you ought never to kill an innocent person, right? Like, you ought never to kill somebody unless that person is like attacking you or whatever. So very simple moral principle. And then, you know, you can appeal to a thought experiment like the trolley problem, and you can say, well, you know, imagine you've got one guy on one track and 10 guys on the other track. And then the point of this is to prompt like an intuition in you. You know, your intuitive response to that is perhaps that actually you should divert the trolley to kill the one guy. And then, you know, the conclusion is going to be, okay, so it turns out we need to modify this principle. We said that the principle was you should never kill anybody unless they are posing a direct threat to you. But it turns out there are actually situations where, you know, we will want to kill people, or at least we do think it's okay to kill people. And I suppose that my general line on these sorts of thought experiments is they're useful for revealing intuitions, but number one, what can often happen in philosophy is that the thought experiments can become so convoluted or weird that any sort of intuition that's prompted by them, I kind of feel like it's just irrelevant. And maybe this isn't the case so much with the trolley problem, because the trolley problem is actually a relatively simple scenario, at least in its original form. Although when you start getting to, you know, more recent developments in the trolley problem, actually it does become kind of convoluted. But, you know, you can find these thought experiments by philosophers. Like there's one in Judith Jarvis Thompson's Defense of Abortion article where she like imagines this thought experiment where there are like people seeds that float around in the air and come through the window, and then we're supposed to, you know, have an intuition about what would be right or wrong to do in this world. And I find that kind of thing just it's like, well, I kind of say, well, I don't know, right? I mean, I no longer have any sort of intuition about what's right or wrong to do when the situation gets so convoluted. And the second point is, it seems to me that, you know, it's perfectly legitimate to just like reject one's immediate moral intuitions. So actually, when the person who endorses the principle that it's wrong to kill anyone who's not immediately posing a threat to you has this intuition that they should change the tracks, well, one thing you could do in response to that is change the principle, but the other thing you could do is just reject the intuition and say, well, actually, yeah, it is wrong to switch the tracks. I mean, obviously, as a moral anti-realist, I see moral principles as being something that we're constructing, and, you know, we can construct them however we want, because it's a construction. So that's
all these principles are based on.
Okay,
I've got you. Thank you. So all these principles are based on some moral basis, as far as I understand. What is this basis? What is a moral principle basis of all times? I don't know. I thought that this basis was for some centuries. For example, God and his love to the human being. And for now, if we after Friedrich Nietzsche, if we could see some moral basis, what we can find on this the first gaze of this basis, of this fundament.
What is the basis of moral principles?
Yeah. What is the basis in, for example, in analytical philosophy?
I mean,
I don't know.
Okay, well, I guess different philosophers will give a different answer here.
I'm not a philosopher, that's why.
I know, and different ones will give a different answer.
Okay.
I'm a moral anti-realist. I'm firmly anti-realist. There are lots of philosophers who are moral realists, who think that there are moral facts, so that, you know, morality is something we discover in the world. And this is not necessarily, in fact, this is not generally going to be due to theism or due to belief in God. Most philosophers are atheists. But even so, most philosophers think that there are still moral facts. They think that we can have moral facts even in the absence of God. I'm not a moral realist, right? So my answer is, what do we base our moral theories on? Well, I think that it's kind of up to us to decide what sort of perspective we want to take. There are different perspectives we can take. One option, as was suggested by the example of the trolley problem, is we can just build our moral theories on our moral intuitions. So, like, I notice that, I propose a moral principle, the principle that it is wrong to kill except in self-defense, and then we apply it to various different cases, such as the case of the trolley problem. And maybe when we look at the trolley problem, you know, I have the intuition that actually it is acceptable to kill there. So I say, okay, I have to change my principle. Of course, the problem with that is different people are going to have different intuitions. Another way that we can construct morality, and I think this is how I tend to approach it, is to say, well, you know, look, there are certain rules which, if followed by everybody, would actually be in my self-interest, right? So there are rules that I can follow that will constrain my behavior. And obviously, if it's constraining my behavior, that might seem that it's against my interest. But actually, as long as everybody else is following those rules, it is in my self-interest. And indeed, it's in everybody else's self-interest. So, for instance, if there's a field, everybody's using the field every single day. The quality of the field is being degraded because everybody's walking on the grass. It's killing the grass. It's killing the plants. But then I say, hey, why don't we all agree that each of us only uses the field once a week? Well, in that case, right, each of us gets to enjoy the field, and the field will flourish, and it will be a beautiful place. And so, although my behavior is being constrained because I can no longer go to the field whenever I want, it's actually promoting my self-interest. It's making all of us better off. It's making me better off, and it's making you better off because we all get to enjoy a beautiful field. And so, you know, we can look at moral rules as being rules that we construct with the aim of maximizing the self-interest of each individual. Now, that's not necessarily going to get you like universal rules, because in fact, different people are going to have, you know, different things in their self-interest. There isn't going to be any particular reason, for instance, why somebody who is super rich should really care that much about people who are poor. Obviously, so if somebody's like really poor, it would make sense for them to favour a rule of wealth redistribution. But if somebody's really rich, and if they have the means of protecting themselves from, rebellion of the poor, they have no reason to favour that rule. So actually, you're not going to get like universal rules out of this. But, you know, we can sort of imagine that the rules are universal. We can act as if they're universal. And I do think that approaching it in this way is useful, because it means that when we're engaging in moral arguments, we can appeal to people's self-interest, which is always going to be the most persuasive thing, I think. You know,
It is always, yeah.
So those are some ways that a moral anti-realist can ground morality.
Okay, so I'm not a philosopher, as I said, but I can think about, for example, a riddle that can that could be related to God directly. In this case, I mean the movie God on Trial, the movie of 2008, as far as I know. So in this movie, main characters ask a question about possibility that related to Martin Buber's topic, I think, where God is responsible and he is in charge of moral problems. So he is a subject of moral problems. So he's some kind of character in this cosmological dilemma. And so this is about Oswensem, about Second World War, about Germans, about Jews and Holocaust and so on. And they answer this question to this question in that way that God can be the subject of this trial, but he cannot be sentenced. For example, he cannot be he cannot be judged with human minds. So, what kind of subjects do we have in moral problems that we could, for example, suggest in our world of technologies? For example, in the world of robots, in the world of artificial intelligence, and so on. Could the subject of these moral problems, could this be, for example, robot or mechanical?
Yeah, I think so. It's worth noting a distinction between like moral responsibility and moral considerability or moral patiency. So, there are a certain class of entities that we take to be morally responsible for their actions. There are a certain class of moral agents. These are the people to whom we would say, you ought not to do this, or it was wrong for you to do this. And this may be different from the entities that are worthy of moral consideration. So, an infant child, we're not going to hold them morally responsible for anything they do, but we still have moral obligations towards them. At least most people think we do, right? Like, I can't just kill an infant. So I guess when you say, like, can robots, when you're asking about whether or not robots can be moral subjects, there's sort of two things that might mean. Like, it would be, okay, can they be moral agents? Can they be held morally responsible for their actions? Or it might be, can they be like subject of moral concern? So
I mean, the second one.
Yeah. So the line that I take on this is that the moral rules are constructed by rational agents for the benefit of rational agents. And when I talk about rational agents, what I mean is people who are capable of, reflecting on their actions. They're capable of holding what we might call second-order desires, where, so a second-order desire is a desire about a desire. So I desire to eat the chocolate cake, but I also desire to be healthy, so I desire not to desire to eat the chocolate cake, as it were. I desire not to have that desire.
Oh my god, some sorrow of desires.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have these things, we can reflect on our desires. People who, have the ability, like I say, to imagine different rules and argue for different rules and so on. So, when we're constructing moral rules, we construct it with the goal of meeting the self-interest or maximizing the self-interest of rational agents in that sense. And it seems to me that I can't see any reason in principle why robots should not meet that standard. Now, as it happens, I don't think there are any robots that do meet that standard at the moment. Maybe there are.
I mean, not robots in itself. I mean, artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, AI,
it's a strong part of artificial intelligence.
I don't see any reason why that there shouldn't be artificial intelligence that meets that standard. I don't think there is at the moment, but I haven't really kept up with the current AI research. I mean, once you get artificial intelligence that is capable of passing the Turing test, right, that's capable of convincingly acting exactly like a normal adult human does, I would say that, that is now it is now going to be a subject of moral concern, because, again, the way I see this is, when we're constructing moral rules, we do it with the goal of negotiating with other people, negotiating rules with other people so as to maximize our own long-run self-interest. And there's no reason in principle why you shouldn't do that with artificial intelligence. It really doesn't matter. I mean, like, so philosophers will kind of ask this question of whether there can be artificial intelligence that's really genuinely conscious, right? So, you know, you might say that consciousness, right, that like the ability to feel, is something that requires a biological brain like the ones that we have in our heads.
Nerves and so on.
Yeah,
With
and
axons and neurons.
My take on this is that's completely irrelevant. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what's going on. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter what's going on even in the heads of other humans. That has no relevance whatsoever to my moral system, right? All I care about is, are they able to, you know, engage in a debate with me? Are they able to negotiate with me about rules, right? About rules that constrain their behavior and mine. And an artificial intelligence, again, could in principle do that. It doesn't matter whether it's feeling anything or whether it has any kind of consciousness or anything like that. And I don't know how I would tell one way or the other. I mean, I'm when it comes to the question of consciousness, I have no idea really where to begin with that one. I do not know how I would ever be in a position to tell whether we had successfully made a conscious computer. So, yeah.
All right. For example, the problem that was raised in a Black Mirror series, when machines that constructed by man could kill without a command. What is the problem of subject and subjectiveness in this moral dilemma? I mean, when some person, for example, I don't know, Heisenberg built a bomb, an atomic bomb that could kill everyone in this earth. What is the moral principles that we can give him? How to say it? That we can say that he need to reply. And in this case of machines, of I don't know, artificial intelligence taxi, artificial intelligence crane, so on, do we need to make this in juridical in a case of law? Do we need to differ these two cases, machines that were built by man and machines that have artificial intelligence?
I don't know. I think that I should say, by the way, I haven't seen the Black Mirror thing, the episode that you were talking about, so I could be missing something here. But like, all that ultimately matters to me when it comes to, you know, judging something's behavior, right, is its observable behavior, right? So I think that the relevant factor is just going to be whether or not the machine is capable of, like, doing the things that humans do and saying the things that humans say. If so, I would just treat it the same way I treat a normal human. And if not, then, well, I guess if not, I'd have to know more about the situation. But yeah, I don't think that it really matters how something was created. It certainly doesn't matter, you know, what's going on inside its head, if anything. So yeah, that's my view anyway.
Okay. And if you go back to the depths of centuries, for example, Immanuel Kant, he suggests a law for all human beings. For example, in wars, or I don't know, in the states of war and the states of peace, and he suggests that there is a global, universal law that all people or not people, or for example, beings that are on planets, for example, on Mars. He researched Mars a lot in his student years, and in all this universe, there are many kinds of subjects, and all these subjects, for example, have intellect. And what we should do about law to implement all this experience of all these subjects in all the universe, that we have one law for all people, one system of law for all people. And in this case, I think it would be great that this law of categorical, how to say it, imperative?
Categorical imperative, yeah.
Imperative?
Yeah.
Yeah, that it works for all people under the stars, for example.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think, is it possible for the future of humans and robots and so on, to make this being a part of reality in some case? I don't know.
I don't find that persuasive myself. I don't see any so first of all, I don't see any reason to believe that rationality is like universal in Kant's sense. So I think what Kant wanted to say was something like, okay, emotions and sentiments can differ from person to person, but ultimately, we like the kind of rules of rationality are the same for everyone. I don't believe that to be true. And like, certainly when it comes to his way of deriving moral rules, I mean, it's always just seemed very bizarre to me. So what Kant wanted to say was something like, all right, the way that you figure out your moral obligations is by asking yourself, like, in a world in which everybody is performing this action, right? Is that, first of all, even coherent? And secondly, would it be a desirable place to live? So, the classic example is something like lying, where he says, lying is morally wrong, and it's morally wrong because if we imagine a world in which, like, everybody lied, then nobody would trust anybody else, and so it would be impossible to lie, because the very, like, what is required in order for a lie to succeed is that other people trust what you're saying. So, like, if everybody was just lying, then nobody would trust what anyone else is saying, and it just wouldn't even be possible to lie. So we can't actually imagine a coherent world in which that takes place. So, lying is morally wrong. But I don't see why this procedure is relevant morally. I mean, like, even if we can kind of specify the details of how this procedure is supposed to be applied, even if it was to give us answers that were in line with our intuitive reactions, which actually in many cases I think Kant's procedure is not. I mean, so he explicitly says that, even if there's like a murderer chasing a victim and the murderer comes to your door and asks where the victim is, you should not lie, because lying is morally wrong. But even if it didn't generate those kinds of cases, I just don't see the relevance of it. I don't see why it matters morally. So I definitely don't think I'm a Kantian with respect to
Oh no,
the moral
Kantian.
questions.
Okay, so as far as I understand, all these cases in his philosophy are reduced to the duty, to the phenomenon of the duty, Pflichte, die Pflichte, der Pflichte. So all these moral states that should be more strong in his own philosophy comes to one thing of duty, and that's strange for me. That's the only strange thing of his moral laws and universal laws, as far as I understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a very kind of reductive view of morality. There's a nice example actually by I can't remember his name. I think it's Michael something, where he says, imagine if you've got a friend in hospital and you go to visit that friend, and they ask why you did it, and you were to say, well, it's because it was my moral duty to do so. I mean, it seems like you do have that there is some sort of moral reason for you to go and visit your friend, but it seems very strange to frame that in terms of duty. So, I mean, I don't find like, again, this isn't something that I see as being a serious issue, but it is something that I think I share your view that it is perhaps reductive.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just a historical view of the laws and the eternal law that Kant suggests. I have an interesting question about hedonism of John Stuart Mill. Yeah, it's a previous question, but
yes,
I think
I forgot it. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. So what do you think about utilitarian hedonism of John Stuart Mill, especially his argument for intellectual pleasure? Mill, was arguing about that intellectual pleasures are better. And I don't really understand, what does Mill qualify as intellectual pleasure? Suppose we know what intellectual pleasure is, but does someone know what pleasure he should have, but can't get it? I don't understand the question. But can get it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay. So it's about the pleasure of intellect that we can share, for example, with other, and that we can get in the way of hedonism, but not hedonism of antiquity, but hedonism of John Stuart Mill.
My understanding of Mill is that the way he draws the distinction, and I mean, I might be misunderstanding the question here, but hopefully I've understood it correctly. So that the question is about this distinction between intellectual pleasures and other types of pleasures. The way that Mill draws the distinction is by appealing to the idea that, look, we can ask people who are familiar with both pleasures, right? So there are going to be people who have experienced the pleasures of food and sex and other sensuous pleasures, and they have also experienced the pleasures of art and intellectual inquiry and science and all of this, right? And philosophical discussion. And so these are people who are competent judges of both types of pleasure. And Mill thinks that if you ask people who are competent judges of both types of pleasure, they will tell you the intellectual pleasures are more fulfilling. And so this is the ground on which Mill tries to justify the distinction between there being like higher pleasures and lower pleasures. So that's why, you know, the intellectual pleasures are more worthy of pursuit. It's because, well, I mean, I guess it's just perhaps a lucky feature of human psychology that actually when we are well acquainted with both types of pleasure, we tend to prefer the intellectual ones. I think that Mill is, I mean, this seems like a really bad argument to me. First of all, because there are actually people who have experienced both types of pleasure and who've said, no, the sensuous pleasures are better. And why wouldn't they count as being just as competent? I mean, so for example, the Marquis de Sade, for example, he favoured the sensuous pleasures, and in fact, in some ways, actually, it seems like the Marquis de Sade might have been even more familiar with the sensuous pleasures and even more competent to judge them than many people in Mill's time were. So, you know, I don't see why his judgment should count for less. Additionally, I think that, and this is just my personal take on this now, I think that all of the problems that people have identified with the sensuous pleasures are equally true of the intellectual pleasures. So, you know, what a lot of people will say is, look, the trouble with pursuing a life where you just try to, you know, acquire as much food and sex and, I don't know, maybe physical excitement as you can is, you know, like, okay, you enjoy the food when you have it, but that pleasure doesn't last very long. You know, it's not particularly fulfilling, like it's not going to kind of contribute to your life long term. Like, you know, you eat the food, it tastes nice, and then that's it. And then later, you know, you're going to be hungry again. So it's not kind of rich. It doesn't have any depth to it. But when I think about my own engagement with philosophy, to me, it seems at times almost pathological. I'm not sure I can explain why I do it. When I do philosophy, especially when it comes to writing philosophy, I find myself in a state of frustration. Right? It's annoying. I want to complete the work, but as I'm working on it, I'm not really enjoying it. I feel like I have to do it, but I don't really get any pleasure out of it. Then once the work is complete, well, I get a bit of pleasure from that, but it doesn't last very long. I mean, and like it's okay, you know, I'll feel happy for maybe 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, but then I just go back to normal. Like the pleasure doesn't last. And what's more, the information that I've learned doesn't last either. I mean, I've got hundreds of videos on my YouTube channel where I can remember literally nothing from them. I would say that I forget about 95% of what I write within a week since writing it. So the intellectual pleasures...
How can it be true? Oh my god.
The intellectual pleasures are not lasting, or, you know, they don't last either. I really... Just again, this is just my own experience. I can't see any reason whatsoever to think that, you know, how did Mill put it? "'Tis better to be Socrates "'Tis better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." Like, I mean, I can't become a pig, but, you know, if I was really wealthy, maybe I could just, you know, roll around in like donuts and just have sex with loads of people and basically do nothing else and never engage with philosophy again. Maybe I really would be perfectly happy doing that. Certainly, I can't. If somebody has a preference for that, I can think of no good argument against them pursuing that sort of life.
Okay, I don't know. I know much about, don't know much about Mill and about Hume and about Kant himself, but I know about ancient philosophy, and that is my question. How do you think? What is the problem of fear for the antique philosophy of antiquity and philosophy of modern times? I mean, mainly romantic philosophers, for example, Sturm und Drang in Germany, philosophers like Goethe, he was a philosopher, by the way, or I don't know, Fichte, or Hegel himself. That is why I think the main problem is the problem of seeing parallels in these histories is that we find, for example, Plutarch himself, that wrote about fear, about gods and fear of gods, about superstitions, Demonia and so on, and fear of God in writings, in manuscripts of, for example, Goethe. And what do you think about fear of human, and maybe with examples in Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, a philosopher?
I don't. I mean, I'm not really familiar with philosophy of fear, so I don't know. I mean, just in general, like as I mentioned, my background is really analytic, and I think it's fair to say that most analytic philosophers have essentially zero concern for these kinds of questions about, you know, human
Really?
experience.
Oh my god!
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. This isn't something that has ever really mattered to me.
So
in my own life.
they answer the fear is an emotion. Fear is an emotion, and we can fight them and struggle them and win. Yeah, or what?
Well, yeah.
What is fear? What is fear in the analytical philosophical school?
Well, I don't think that there is like an analytic philosophy of fear. This is exactly my point. It's again, analytic philosophers aren't really concerned with questions of meaning and experience and so on. I mean, there is a philosophy of emotion, but the questions there will tend to be like whether or not emotions ultimately just reduce to bodily states, or whether they are cognitive, like whether they involve thoughts. I myself, I don't really have an opinion. I tend to think that, like, if you ask me what is fear, I would say, I guess I'd be inclined to say, well, what we call fear is, like, we apply that term to a host of different experiences that may not have anything in particular really underlying them. I mean, there are so many different things that can count as fear. Like I for instance, can be outside for a walk. I like see a bear, and I suddenly like jump and run away from the bear. I mean, that's a very visceral fear. That's fear of a physical threat. And then there's fear in the sense of like contemplating one's death in the future. That's kind of more abstract, and it's not something that's going to make you run. It's maybe going to create feelings of dread. But so there's all these different kinds of things that we classify as fear, and then there can be fear for other people as well. So like fear for something that's going to happen to another person. All these different kinds of things. I see fear as just the concept of fear is a useful way of, classifying human behavior. We've found a pattern in human behavior, but I don't have like anything particularly substantial to say about it, and I'm not really aware of there being much work by analytic philosophers on fear, although there probably is. I mean, but it's not something I'm familiar with.
Okay. Even me. So there is an interesting question. Thank you, Natspori, for 100 rubles. What do you think about? Have you read Hammond's Metacritic? Hammond. I don't know how to spell it.
I am not sure. What was the name of the
Hammond Metacritic? Haman? I don't know. Haman Metacritic.
I don't think so.
Okay. Nevertheless, thank you very much for 1,000 rubles. What moral questions do you want to research in your philosophical work? What main philosophical directions do you think is the most relevant to these days? For example, philosophy of choice, or I don't know how to call it. I'm not an analytical philosopher.
Well, those are two separate questions. The question of what I would want to research is not necessarily the same as the question of what's relevant today.
Yeah, there's two different questions.
Yes. I'm not. I suppose that. Okay, what's relevant today? Well, I guess stuff about climate change, environmental problems. That seems pretty relevant to me. I think that there is a lot of philosophical work on that, and that seems to connect pretty directly with a very significant problem that we all face, and that's like a global problem. So yeah, I suppose if you ask me what's the most relevant, I would say philosophical work on climate change, maybe philosophical work on technology.
On climate change,
ethical,
how does it work?
Well, so the question was about moral questions, right? So I guess
global climate change is a moral question.
Yes, I think so. I mean, there would be questions about, like, okay, how ought we to respond to this? And in particular, how ought the, like, negative effects of various policies be distributed, let's say. So, I mean, environmental ethics is just in general a pretty big field. So there's I guess, on the one hand, you've got these more like applied ethics questions where we're evaluating the moral status of different proposed policies in response to climate change, and then there's the kind of well, maybe more abstract question or more philosophical question of, like, you know, for instance, who counts, right? What sort of entities actually matter? Because if we think, for instance, that only humans matter, then that will suggest a different response to problems like climate change than if we think that humans and wild animals matter. And again, that in itself will suggest a different response than if we think that humans and wild animals and, say, the natural environment itself matters. There are some philosophers who think that, you know, there's intrinsic value to wilderness or to the biosphere in itself. So, you know, those are all philosophical questions. As for the questions that I would like to focus on, I don't actually work that much in moral philosophy, and there isn't, at least I don't think there's anything in moral philosophy that's really exciting me at the moment. Most of my work is in philosophy of science and epistemology. I'm interested in thinking more about the nature of rationality. I think if I continue to pursue philosophy, I will be turning my attention to that topic. So yeah.
All right, and what is the main questions that you think could be solved in a spare years? I mean, in a spare decades. For example, a question that depends on choice about ecology or about machines, about artificial intelligence, and so on and so on and so on.
What questions do I think will be solved?
Could be solved.
Well, it depends on what you mean by solved, because I think that loads of philosophical questions have been solved. The problem is that no other philosophers, or very few other philosophers, accept the correct solutions. I am only half joking when I say that. So I mean, like, you might say, okay, that's to solve a philosophical question is to get to the right answer. But obviously, if you ask me,
not really right answer, but the answers that would be adopted by everyone, by 99% of people.
Okay, so that's the definition then, that we're going to form a consensus on it. I have no idea. I think that it's kind of in the nature of philosophy that we avoid consensus. I think philosophy tends to proceed by proliferating different views on particular topics, and in fact that might even be, in some sense, what philosophical progress consists in, right? Like we kind of explore the conceptual landscape, let's say. So when I look at, you know, all the philosophical fields in contemporary philosophy, what I see is just an increasing diversity of views and an increasing proliferation of views. And sometimes philosophers will kind of jump on certain bandwagons, you know, so pretty much all philosophers, well, maybe not all, but a very large number of philosophers in contemporary analytic philosophy are physicalists. I'm not a physicalist. It seems to me that the arguments for physicalism are appallingly weak, but for some reason they've all leapt on that particular bandwagon. At least I think it's a bandwagon. If you ask somebody who is a physicist, they say there's very good reasons for it. But I do think that it's not too controversial to say that there can be philosophical fashions. So, but obviously predicting what the next philosophical fashion will be is not something.
And what's now in fashion? What's now in fashion? Analytical philosophy.
Physicalism, for instance, I would say.
Physicalism.
I would say.
Oh, it's so strange because it's main fashion of 18th century, as far as you know, of Lametry and rationalists and epoch of mind and of brain and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Physicalism. That's strange. Okay, I didn't know that. And what's the main question that, for example, we use in everyday life? Moral question that we that we should solve for ourselves. The question about relations between relation between different peoples. For example, question about, for example, this is a political theme, about migration in Europe. Is it a moral question that we should solve or not?
I'm not sure that so when you say solve, I mean, I don't know exactly what you have in mind there, but that seems to be a question that is,
I mean, consensus, that we could get a consensus in this question.
Oh, I don't think we'll get a consensus on that. I mean, that seems extremely optimistic. I think that the conflicts in values are that there are fundamental conflicts in values that like drive different positions on the migration issue, and I don't know. I mean, where would a consensus come from? Like, I can't see a way of. I mean, policies will change, right? Like, no doubt, perhaps over the next 10, 20 years. In fact, I think it's so. Here's what I think is quite likely, right? It seems to me that I've mentioned climate change. If we take seriously the predictions of our best climate models, then it looks like we're going to see significantly higher rates of migration in the future. At the same time, we're going to see declining living standards worldwide. I mean, but also in our countries, I think both of these things will probably lead to more resistance to immigration. So I would expect...
in my country now would change. Sorry.
Well, I would expect, at least over here, if I had to make a prediction, I expect that we will become stricter on immigration as a result of these two things. But who really knows? Humans are notoriously difficult to predict, and so I'm really not committing myself to that. And I certainly don't think we're going to ever come to like a consensus about it. Like okay, maybe in the future, we'll have like a lot more people who favour building the wall or whatever, but there's still going to be a lot of people who don't favour that, and.
Yeah, I mean, Games of Thrones, Game of Thrones, certainly.
So I think
not the real war in the border of Mexico and the UC.
We could probably identify like general trends, right? I mean, but that's as good as it gets.
Right. And what about moral questions and scientific progress? I mean, Heidegger, that you're not a specialist in Heidegger philosophy. What kind of progress and scientific progress problems do we have in our moral card for now? I mean, Heidegger posts, he claims that all kinds of progresses of scientific, technical, and industrial progresses, and people of these types of society, they have no personal being, because all kind of their experience is diluted in machines, in factories, in plants, and so on. And what do you think about this kind of problem, kind of dilemma that in future there could be much more machines that would work in the place of humans, and that human would have more spare time in their life, like in I don't know, for example, 18th century or in medieval times?
Well, to me, that doesn't sound like a problem. That sounds like it would be a good thing. But I also think it's extremely optimistic. Look, if I had to take a bet, that's not where I see society going. I think that society will probably continue pretty much as it is. I mean, there's going to be some automation but I don't think it's going to make a huge difference to people's daily lives over the next couple of decades, and then it's just going to gradually decline as we run out of resources and as we face the problems of environmental degradation. I don't. The future of like automating everything and everybody having free time, I would love that, but I'm not going to bet on it.
Stephen Pinkes states. Stephen Pinkes, he's like a sociologist, psychologist. I don't know actually. He states that the main problems of leisure classes, of noble classes of medieval times or times of modern age, was aristocracy, was drunkenness, laziness, series of suicides, and so on, and that this the fate of the aristocracy, the fate of noblemen of Europe, could bear modern people of Europe, because they would have more spare time, more time for their laziness, more time for their thoughts, more time to be with their families, and I don't know, thoughts of suicide and so on.
I don't think that, generally speaking, people are inclined towards laziness. And maybe this is me being optimistic now, but most people, it seems to me, generally want to be productive and like do things with their life. Most people as far as I can tell, they don't seem to want to just, sit on a couch playing games all day. But even if they did, that's fine, in my opinion. I don't think there's anything wrong with drunkenness, nor do I think there's anything wrong, and maybe I shouldn't say this, I'm not sure what the because the rules on this are a bit strict now, but so I might not be able to elaborate, but I don't think there's actually anything wrong with committing suicide either. Not that I would encourage anyone to do it, I just don't think there's anything wrong with it. I don't think there's a good argument against it if somebody... I mean, look, my evaluation of my life is that it's basically negative. I kind of hinted at this earlier when I said that, even doing philosophy is mostly just frustrating. And I do wonder if there is anything that keeps me alive other than the simple fact that I'm just terrified of death. If somebody doesn't have a fear of death, I really don't know what I could say to them. So, drunkenness, drunkenness, laziness, suicide, none of these are problems in my opinion. That may not be a particularly popular opinion, but there it is. I think it's up to you. I'm very libertarian about this kind of stuff. It's up to you to decide what to do with your life. And if you are in a position where you are enabled to make choices about your life, if you're able to make the choice to just become a drunkard, I think that's wonderful. That's fantastic. If you're no longer in a position where you are compelled to work to survive, right, and you're able to just be lazy and drunk and maybe even just kill yourself, that is wonderful.
Okay.
So
I condemn the suicide and self-harm, by the way, we're on Twitch. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not advocating it, and certainly
I know. I do say that there.
Yeah. So to be clear, it is not something that I am advocating, but let's put it this way, right? Like, forget about the suicide thing. The people getting drunk and lazy and just doing what they... I want people to be able to do what they want with their own lives, right? I want people to be able to make their own decisions without being compelled, either due to coercion from other people or due to, a lack of resources which forces them to take, one of a very small number of options just to keep themselves alive. What Pinker is describing as a problem there is not, in my view, a problem at all.
Severe, strong, analytical philosophers. It's not a problem at all for me.
That's not necessarily the view of most analytical philosophers. That's just my view.
I know. It's just one of. one of analytical philosophers. You, Kane. No, it's a great position. I think it's nice. I have another position in a question of random in the case of moral questions. For example, I would like to ask you about random in moral matters, more like matters of different kind of events in human in human life. For example, a man woke up behind a bus. He didn't have time, and he met the love of all his life, for example. Yeah, that's a strange example. Okay, but if he not met her, not met his person, all his experiences, all his moral, all his desires, all his sufferings of this love, there won't be any of these questions in his life. And what analytical philosophy thinks about random in moral questions, about random as a concept, as a concept. Sorry.
I don't know. Yeah. So there is a literature on what's sometimes called moral luck, and there is a literature about
moral luck. Moral luck.
Is that the kind of thing? I feel like this might be something different though. So the example that
it's a little bit different, but the thing is about luck, about random, and about all this situation that a person cannot know in the first time.
So is the question about like what they ought to do given the conditions of uncertainty?
What they ought to do if they don't know everything about everything.
I mean, I suppose it depends on the moral theory in question. I mean, as I see it, this is like quite a serious problem for views like utilitarianism and consequentialist views, insofar as we can't. I mean, so this kind of position that we're describing, right, where we're in position where we're in a situation of uncertainty, that is in fact the situation that all of us are in all the time. Like we do not know what the consequences of our actions will be, except in like the very, relatively very near future and very immediate environment. But everything that I do is going to have downstream consequences. Like even just taking a sip of this water, right? Well, that changes. The world would be different had I not taken a sip of that water. And if you kind of trace out those consequences years down the line, if you ask the question, what would the world be like had I not drunk that water? Well, I mean, not only do I not know, there isn't really an answer at all, right? Because it depends on what else you change. So I don't know. Again, I'm not sure if this is quite the issue you were raising, but I do think that this point might pose a bit of a problem for people who think that what we ought to do is dependent on the consequences of our actions. And the reason is that I think it's basically impossible to evaluate, or it's impossible to compare the actual consequences of our actions with the consequences of some other action that we haven't taken, right? The counterfactual consequences. That counterfactual scenario is completely indeterminate. So that, I guess, is an issue that it arises there, but I'm not sure if that was the issue you were referring to.
Okay, this question about our discussion on Calliopean Club. I mean, mine and one of the analytical philosophers. He told me, he was German. He told me in a Calliopean Club that the problem of choice does not propose the assumption of the fact, but the person who acts in this moral action with a direct vision of the action and his consequences, person wants and he can take responsibility for this action, even if it is not consequences of his own action. If he does this, if he take responsibility for the action, then it is his moral action, and the random thing is only could be found only in these interactions, only in interactions with subject and object of this person who takes responsibility. Is it correct?
So,
in a sense of analytical philosophy,
are we imagining a situation in which, so one person performs an action, and then another person claims to take responsibility for that action?
For example, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So one person shoots someone in the head, and then somebody else says, "Actually, I'm responsible for that."
Yeah, like in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
I mean, I don't know. I suppose different analytic philosophers would have different views here. Although I mean, my take on this is, I mean, I can't, like, why I just don't see why we would. So unless like somebody was coerced into performing the action, you know, if Frank holds a gun to Vincent's head and says to Vincent, right, kill a person or I'll kill you, then it makes sense to say that Frank is responsible for the killing. But putting aside situations like that, I mean, why would we think that moral responsibility can be just like taken by another person in that kind of way?
Because person takes responsibility for an action even if he does not see the connection between his action and the consequences. Because action, yeah.
Okay, so you're responsible for what you do, right? Even if you're mistaken about what the consequences will be. Yeah. Okay. I think it would depend on the situation, insofar as, I mean, I haven't thought about this topic that much, but I suppose the obvious line would be to say, well, you know, like, you're responsible for what would be the foreseeable consequences, maybe. I mean, like, if a reasonable person could, again, assuming the kind of cognitive capacities that humans have and assuming the kind of information that was available at the time, if a normal person would be able to, like, easily foresee certain consequences, like, if I just chuck a brick off a building, well, you know, we all have a certain amount of background knowledge, right? Including the fact that at the bottom of the building, there are going to be people walking around. And we all know that if a brick at high velocity hits a person on the head, it can seriously injure or kill them. Okay, so I'm working with that background information. I throw the brick off the building. I mean, it wouldn't really be a good excuse to say, if it harms somebody, that I just didn't realize it would harm someone, or that, you know, I didn't think about that, because I should have thought about it. Even if it's true that I didn't think about it, I should have thought about it. So yeah, I mean, there probably is like a detailed literature on this question, but it's not a literature that I have engaged with myself. So yeah, I don't have much to say about that, I guess.
Okay, it's my problem. I will I will ask this person from the Calliopean Club again and make a more clear vision of his consciousness, for example. We have interesting moral case. My subscriber asked me, there is one grave digger in Russia. He did not kill anyone. He didn't harm anyone, but he was arrested and kept under compulsory treatment, a long custodial sentence. And the more question is, can he be released for now or not? Or he is very dangerous and I don't know how to say, criminal guy. Or it's not a problem of morality. I mean, grave digging and so on. His name is Anatoly Moskvin.
So this guy, what, dug up graves that he wasn't supposed to be digging up? Is that it?
Yeah,
he I don't care about
digged up
that.
graves and took corpse of these graves.
Yeah, okay,
And yeah,
I
and
don't care. Do what you want to
collected this corpse in his apartment.
Yeah, I mean, look, so most people seem to hold corpses as having, let's say, a kind of important moral status, right? And in particular, I guess, you know, a corpse might count as being property. Like if you like look at it from, you know, the point of view of, well, a person owns their body, and I guess they can, you know, determine what happens to their body after death. So in that sense, like, I'm perfectly happy with there being a rule that, you know, you can't just do whatever you want to corpses. But I don't know, man. When corpses have been buried, it seems like, you know, once it's in the ground, it's not really, like, nobody's taking ownership of it anymore. You know, you're not using it for anything. So I don't really care. Like, yeah, I think if somebody wants the corpse, and nobody else is using it, and if it's in the ground, then no one else is using it, then I personally don't see a problem with that. I certainly think it's ridiculous to say that this guy is a danger to anyone. I mean, obviously it's not dangerous. He's just digging up corpses. That doesn't harm anybody. I mean, it might offend them. It might maybe make them upset if it's like the corpse of their mum or whatever. But like, again, I mean, honestly, my take on this is that we should allow people to have more control over what happens to the corpses of loved ones. And if you actually care about the corpse of your loved one, maybe, like, put it, I don't know, if you don't want that corpse to be interfered with, have a cremation or something like that. Because once you're cremated, nobody can do anything to your corpse. But yeah, if you're putting a corpse in the ground, like, who cares? I mean, a lot of people care. So I don't know why I said that, but I personally don't care. And I think this guy should be released. I can't see any grounds for imposing this loss of liberty on him.
So he should be released. Yeah, in your thing.
Yeah, I don't think anything should happen to him. If all he's done is dig up some graves, I don't care about that at all. I mean, I guess maybe it counts as, like, vandalizing church property or whatever, but I don't care about that either, really. So, yeah, I would let him go if I was king.
King of Scotland.
Yeah, if I were the king, that's what I would do.
Okay. So we have another discussion about art. Our channel is about art too, about suprematism. Suprematism is a kind of direction of art of avant-garde of 20th century of Malevich.
Oh, okay.
What is your position about contemporary art, and what criteria make it possible to distinguish good art from bad, in your opinion? Okay,
well, my position on contemporary art is I like quite a lot of it. I'm actually really into a lot of modern art, and I mean, particularly art from, like, 1900s onwards, and not just in the context of painting. I mean, you mentioned, like, Malevich and that, but I really love, like, a lot of, you know, avant-garde and experimental music. Not so much film, actually. I don't really watch much experimental film, but
art house.
Yeah, you know, I don't really like art house films that much. I usually find them quite pretentious and annoying. But yeah, when it comes to, like, music and painting, definitely I listen to and view all sorts of you know, like, the music that I listen to is basically just noise, and the You know, I love paintings that are just chaos, or not chaos, or maybe they're just like blank canvases or whatever. I'm really into all that stuff. Abstract stuff, yeah, all of that. Now, you asked what the criteria was, for distinguishing good and bad art. I mean, like, look, there aren't. I mean, I've already said I'm a moral anti-realist, right? I don't think there are any, moral values. I don't think there's any objective moral goodness. It probably shouldn't be a surprise to hear that I don't think there's any objective aesthetic goodness. There aren't like aesthetic values in the world. The criteria for good and bad art is ultimately just a matter of, whether or not you like it. That's it. That's the fundamental. Grounding criteria, right? Something counts as good art if it happens to produce a positive response in you of some sort or another. So yeah, like the kind of aesthetic criteria are constructed by us in the same way as we, construct moral criteria and other normative criteria. So, I happen to like a lot of contemporary art, but, a lot of people don't. That's fine. I wouldn't say that they are incorrect or anything. We just have different tastes.
Yeah, different tastes, and it's not a moral question. Okay. So I condemn the word, the N word in the chat. Okay. Very cringe thing. Okay, and do you have any academic works on Academia EDU or I don't know, in the G-Store? Do you have any works? Academic recensed works on some resources that we could read and.
Yeah, well,
and I could recommend our auditory.
I mean, I don't know if there would be any point recommending them because they're not like I have published some things, but like it's really just very technical material that is like directed to other people who happen to be interested in the very narrow field that I'm interested in. I mean my sort of most I guess the publication in the most prestigious journal was something I made from my I drew it from my PhD, and it's called Guieri's Instrumental Perspectivism. But I don't really, again, I mean, if people want to read it, I think it's open access, actually. You can just look up Guieri's Instrumental Perspectivism and read it, but I wouldn't recommend it. If I was recommending philosophical articles for people to read, I would recommend something very different from that. When it comes to my own work, the stuff I would recommend is like the public engagement stuff I've done on YouTube, rather than any articles. When I write basically just for other philosophers, and even to me, it's not very entertaining. I can't imagine it would be entertaining to anyone else.
And what's your plans for the? For your YouTube channel, or maybe other platform for a Patreon, for example?
Well, the Patreon, I made it just so people could like throw over some money if they wanted to. Even when I initially made it, it wasn't. I don't know, like, because a lot of people do stuff with their Patreon channels. They'll, upload like special content just for patrons and things like that. I couldn't really think of anything to do for that, so I literally have only I just made it to sort of say to people, hey, you know what, if you appreciate what I do and you want to give me a hand, you can give me some money this way, but I don't have any special plans for it. As for the YouTube channel, I intend to just continue uploading lectures on philosophy and maybe doing things like this in the future. The next thing, I've finished the script for it. I have, and this is actually quite outside my usual area that I work in, but I've got a video on the Marquis de Sade coming up. not an analytic philosopher. So that's something.
Quite not.
That's something
Okay.
completely new for me. But
Okay.
that should be up in a few days.
It's a strange choice for me. Mark is the son. Oh. So please support our today's guest. Subscribe on his channel, and he will have more interesting content coming out for you. So I mean my auditory, yeah. So are there any other themes and other topics that you want to discuss for me? If we could have some next conversation in a, I don't know, in a month later or so on. Maybe I'm a specialist in history, and I could say that we could make some discussion about philosophy of Wittgenstein, for example, or philosophy of I don't know, Vienna Club.
Oh yes, well, I mean the Vienna Club and the logical positivists in general is something that I mean, as I say, I'm a pretty hardcore empiricist, and so I have significant disagreements with the Vienna Club, but I am very much with them in spirit, let's say. So that might be interesting.
Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you for the conversation. I will say again that I'm not a philosopher, and therefore it's not my cup of tea. That is why I'm so cringy today.
No, thank you for that. That was thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you for the very interesting conversation about moral problems, about moral questions, and about analytical philosophy at all. And I think that if you want to have a next conversation, we can find some kind of correct theme in our mail, maybe in private mail.
Cool.
Okay, nice. Thank you very much.
Bye.